Hi everyone, and welcome back to Philanthropy. On today's episode, we have a guest who is going to teach us all about truth and reconciliation and the wellness and healing that we can work towards as a result of this kind of education. So the guest that we have is also another podcaster, which is really super cool. Her name is Tammy Wolfe, and she is coming to us from Winnipeg, and she is a very, very busy lady. So I'm very grateful that she's here to join us today. She's an Indigenous consultant. She is an educator, so she's a lecturer at the University of Winnipeg, the University of Brandon, the University of Manitoba. She is also a PhD candidate, and we'll get her to talk about that a little bit here. And she is really very educated in a lot of the truth and reconciliation stuff, particularly where it affects missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in 2S+. I think I got that right. Okay, it's a long acronym, and we're going to get Tammy to unpack a lot of this. So when I began this podcast, Tammy had reached out to me. She knew I was looking for really amazing people to interview, and I'm so grateful she did, because I have a feeling today is going to be a very exciting episode. She is very knowledgeable from what I know so far. So welcome, Tammy.
Thanks, Jessica. I appreciate you welcoming me here, and I'm glad to come and share with your listeners.
Wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into this work to begin with? Because it sounds like there's a lot of intersection in all of these areas in your life, and they all kind of come together really quite beautifully. So if you can just share with us how that all happened.
Absolutely. So it started the day I was born. Just kidding. So I would have to say, going back like many of our Indigenous people, I have been largely impacted by pretty much every systemic issue that is still continuing to impact Indigenous peoples today. And, those impacts, and, predominantly being raised in the child welfare system, my mom being a 60 scoop survivor, all of those things within my life, could have made me go in a different direction, a very different direction, right? And I kind of feel like I took all of those things that kind of happened to me, and I turned it into where I'm at now, right? My work with truth and reconciliation, and really trying to go out there and educate, right? Because I have an education degree, and so like my passion really is for teaching. I wanted to learn. I'm a lifelong learner. So I'm always looking for new ways and new things. And that's probably why I connected with you as well, right? Doing the networking thing. And as I began to go through, my own healing from those impacts, and then going into my education degree, I realized I want to keep learning. I want to teach. And this is what I'm passionate about, right? And so I wanted to use my story so that I could try to inspire others, right? Because I knew that I can't do this work on my own, right?
Absolutely. And so can you tell me a little bit about the consulting that you do?
So my consulting, let's plug my consulting. So www.tammygwolfconsulting.com. So I started that business back in 2019, and I actually, again, in alignment with my story and my lived experiences, right? I really wanted to go out into community and begin, doing that heart work, because I feel like the work that I do isn't just helping community; it's also helping myself. It's helping me to heal and to go through some of the things, the ongoing things that I'm even still impacted by today, right? And so I really feel like that heart work is the basis of my consulting company. And I consult people on many different things. So I've done, lots of keynotes. I've done lots of workshops, different people, different organizations. I teach teachers, students. I've also, some of the things that I've done recently, I've been doing a lot of land acknowledgement stuff. People want to learn about land acknowledgements and like how they might be able to bring that into their business so that other people, because that's pretty much what my consulting company does is it helps people to bring their businesses or organizations in alignment with the 94 calls to action.
That's really amazing. And is that related to your PhD in any way? How does that fall in there?
So my PhD, so I actually have a master's in Indigenous governance. And so my master's in Indigenous governance focused on the people like myself who are not involved in the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. As I mentioned, I'm impacted by many of those things, having lost my mom. And the way in which I focused on policing. And so I feel like all of that governance around policing, around the Indian Act, around, all of those things are in alignment of truth and reconciliation. And so everything that I've studied in my master's that moved me into my PhD, I read 100 books. I don't know. Well, I know this is a podcast, so people can't see, but Jessica can see my big library behind me. I had to read 100 books for my PhD comps, and it wasn't just focused on like my master's topic on MMIWG2S. It's on essentially Indigenous studies. So yeah, I feel like all of those things are so interrelated, and we can really see that by looking at the 94 calls to action or even the 231 calls for justice in the national inquiry, because these are leveled problems. Like you cannot address the issues within child welfare without addressing policing, right? Or without addressing healthcare, because they're so interrelated, and we can see that, right?
And this must be some of the work that you're doing as an educator also, as a lecturer at the universities.
Yes. So currently I'm teaching Pathways to Indigenous Wisdom. So what I also did in my master's is I looked at land-based methods of healing and ceremonial healing. And so largely what the course that I'm looking at right now or teaching right now is I'm working with graduate students, and we're looking at essentially pathways to Indigenous wisdom, right? Looking at spirituality and looking at how Indigenous people have come to know, looking at those connections to all my relations and these reciprocal relationships that we have to our world, right? And our worldview as Indigenous peoples, because for those of you who might not know, right, Western worldviews are very, very different than Indigenous worldviews. And the way that we have come to know and understand and our philosophical understandings of ourselves, of place, seeing, being, doing, thinking, and knowing, right?
Absolutely. And I know that you do a lot of this work on your podcast. And so you were just sharing with me that you just finished your 6th season, or you're going into your 6th season?
I'm going into my 6th season. So we just finished the 5th season. A great season, honestly. I feel like it's taken me a while. So essentially my podcast began as a radio show. So we used to broadcast, or I guess we're still broadcasting old episodes on University of Winnipeg, 95.9. I'm just trying to think of the radio station. So 95.9 FM here in Winnipeg. And we started in late 2018 and then began airing in 2019. I feel like it was great. And this is probably the only time I'll say this. COVID was great because it allowed people to do what we're doing now. You're in Saskatoon, I'm in Winnipeg. So really connecting. My radio show kind of changed and evolved over COVID and into 2020 and then into 2021, where I began to shift, right? Because I wanted to continue doing my radio programming, but I couldn't be in the studio anymore, right? So it was like, there was like this big shift. There was this big pivot where I was like, I want to continue doing this and I want to continue helping and educating people. And how am I going to be able to do this? First, we started on the phone, and then we shifted to online. And so I want to say my podcast began kind of just highlighting, those stories of reconciliation. And I had a lot of, I want to say, Indigenous guests coming on and telling their stories, kind of like I'm doing here today with you. And just really trying to, encourage people, like, what are actions that we can take to try to address the 94 calls to action. But the last season, we actually kind of shifted. And I really like what we accomplished last year. I had some really amazing guests, and I feel like last season, we were also recognized by Imaginative. We were streamed there at that film and media festival, and I had guests like Nigan Sinclair. We had a lot of academics, a lot of people like myself who are educated, and just really trying to talk about the issues. And it was kind of a chronological focus where we kind of talked about all of these things to try to educate people. So for those of you who'd like to listen, it is available on Spotify. It's available, I just looked today, it's available on Amazon Music as well. Deezer, I believe it's available on Apple as well. But yeah, it's a chronological focus. So if you're interested to know the history, topics were colonization, treaties, the Indian Act. Like I think in like 45 minutes we talked about the whole Indian Act, which is pretty crazy. It's an amazing short pieces of information that people can process. And so I hope that people will take a look, take a listen.
Absolutely. That's really incredible. I definitely want to check out some of these podcasts too. When we were kind of talking about truth and reconciliation, I really like that you had mentioned, and that's what your podcast is called, Truth Before Reconciliation. Do you want to unpack why you called it Truth Before Reconciliation?
Absolutely. As an educator, what I began to notice, and let's go back to like 2018, right? So this is kind of where I was working in government at the time. So I was working as a policy analyst. I was in my master's, and I was in all of these circles where I was, in community, I was in government, but I was also in, community organizations, doing all of this work, and the school system. And everything I kept hearing was reconciliation, reconciliation, reconciliation. We still see it today in 2025, 10 years later. And I'm like, why are we not talking about truth? Right? 2018 was 3 years after the release of the 94 calls to action. And I felt like that was my question. Like, this was the question that I kept popping up in my mind. And it was telling me, like, why is everybody continuing to push the narrative of reconciliation when we haven't even gotten through truth? Because I was sitting, like I said, in circles and even with coworkers in government where I was educating them on things that I felt that they should know, other policy analysts, people who are working in government, and, and they didn't have specified training or, which is one of the calls to actions, right? Is that public service workers need to have this education. They need to have this training. They should know these things. And so that's where I began to just really think, like, that's what I need. That's the message that I need to send to people, is that we are still in the truth phase. And the only way that we're going to be able to get to reconciliation is through truth. And we can still see, even today, 10 years later, we are still in truth.
And how do you think that we can move that from truth to reconciliation?
Okay. Well, I mean, I keep talking about education, and I mean, I am a little biased, just a tad, in regards to education, because obviously, like, how are we going to know the truth without education, right? But I think even more so when we think about truth, what does that mean? Right? What does that mean to everybody? Because I've had people on my podcast who have talked about, oh, truth is different for everybody. Right? Everybody's reality is different because they see the world in that way. And so, earlier I mentioned worldviews, right? But the fact that when we think about truth, I think truth really comes from the inside. And so where I begin to move when I think about truth and how we're going to get there beyond education is healing. Like final episode of last season, the truth about healing. Because that is where we need to look. That is where we need to go. And I don't think that there's enough people out there, Canadians, who are ready for this conversation on healing, right? On their need to heal. Right? Because a lot of people think that it's oh well, how am I impacted, or I don't have a role and responsibility. That happened, that was history. That happened a long time ago. Like, this doesn't have anything to do with me. I don't need to heal. And see, that is where the truth comes in. Because if people are able to recognize that the truth is that this is not an Indigenous problem, this is a Canadian issue.
Right.
And we are not going to get to reconciliation until we all acknowledge that. I'm going to share my dad's words. I remember when I started my podcast, my dad's words of wisdom. Until we make an agreement what that truth is, all come to acknowledge truth and then find out what that means, there can be no reconciliation.
Very powerful. And do you believe that we will ever see reconciliation in this generation?
No. As an educator, as somebody who is 100% impacted by systemic issues that are still impacting Indigenous people today, my daughter's the first person in my family to not be apprehended. I was raised in child welfare. My mom was part of the 60s scoop. My siblings were apprehended. Both are now deceased. I just lost my brother. He was 25. I lost him in March. He was adopted. He only came back into my life in 2017, right? I don't say this in a jaded way. I don't say this in a negative way. A lot of people, they're like, oh, how can you do all this work if you don't believe that we're going to see reconciliation? I believe in my daughter, and I believe in my daughter's children, my grandchildren, and my great-grandchildren. And I believe those teachings that we talk about as Indigenous people, that we need to think about the 7 generations past. We need to understand our history in order to think of those 7 generations forward. That's the reason why I do this, because I know that we can make it to reconciliation. I won't see it, and I'm not going to benefit from reconciliation. We might see acts of reconciliation, which is very different. But I do believe that hopefully my grandchildren or my grandchildren's children will see full reconciliation.
I think that's a really beautiful and realistic way to approach it. But that being said, it's still a lot of hard work, right, on the part of Indigenous people and even those who are willing to do that work, the non-Indigenous people who maybe are coming with an ally attitude, and then of course the ones who are struggling to understand if they even have a role in any of it. Like you said, it's a Canadian issue. So keeping that in mind, let's look at the Indigenous side first, and then maybe we can go to the non-Indigenous side. What are some things that Indigenous people could do to motivate themselves, to nurture themselves as they're doing this work, which is not going to be easy work? And if, exactly like you said, we may not see this in our own lifetime, other than acts of reconciliation, what are some things that we could do to take care of ourselves doing this work?
So the first thing that comes to mind, and I'll take a page from my conceptual framework for my PhD, beadwork is medicine. You need to think about self. You need to go back to self, because I can't tell someone what it's going to take for them to heal. You know, right? The same way that I know what it's going to take for me to heal. My spirit knows, right? Returning to that physical, that mental, that spiritual, that emotional, and you need all of those things, but you need to understand self first. And I think that there's a lot of people out there who don't know that because they're hurting.
Yep, absolutely. I think, the healing journey, and of course that's what this podcast is about, right? A lot of wellness. It's about community service. It's about how do we take care of ourselves so that we can take care of others and take care of the world, and recognizing that all of us are on a healing journey, especially Indigenous
Right.
people, definitely Indigenous people. But I do like that you mentioned that a lot of non-Indigenous people need to do healing too, and maybe they're not acknowledging it, right? If they're in complete denial, then that's already a signal that they need to be doing the work to come to terms with their role. And because I 100% agree. One of my best friends is a white lady, and we have very intense conversations sometimes, and she really helps me to understand her side, I guess, in her perspective, and we have those honest conversations where we talk to each other and teach each other, right? And I definitely know that there's times where I'm completely ignorant, and then there'll be times where she'll ask me, why do Indigenous people say Bepsi? Things like that, right? And so we have a lot of talks, and I remember
Just kidding. We say those things.
And one of the things, when we first became friends, we were 14 years old, and she said to me, and I had just, been talking about residential school, and I was probably getting very passionate about it.
Right.
And she said, you know what, like, I didn't do that, Jess. She's like, I would never in a million years do anything like that to anybody. And she's like that did happen in the past, like there were other people who did it, but I want you to know that I would never ever do that to you or anybody. And, like, I'm sorry I'm white, but I wouldn't hurt you, kind of thing, and we were both crying. It was a really intense moment. And as we've gotten older, of course, we've been friends for 32 years or something. She's really helped me to understand things like white privilege.
Right.
I didn't even know what this was until she pointed it out to me. And then we had to talk about it. And so now when I've had moments like that, even at work, where I've had to struggle with somebody's white privilege, I'll talk with her about it, and we talk really honestly, and she helps me to understand things where, sometimes it's so heated in those moments, and if people aren't understanding why they feel that the way they feel and how they feel, then, sometimes that's part of the problem, right? And we need to be able to have these conversations. Like I always feel so empowered after talking with her, because, it's like light bulbs are going off. And I just think it's really super powerful. But like, can you speak to anything about that with like your experience as an Indigenous person, even working in government? I know that's going to be a struggle, right? Like there's going to be a lot of white privilege there
in regards to privilege, white privilege.
Yeah.
And I think one of the main things that I often teach to people is that many people don't know what that means. They don't know what privilege means, because they think, for example, they'll say, "Oh, well, I'm not privileged. I grew up in a lower middle class home, and we weren't rich, and we didn't have this, we didn't have that." And what they don't understand is that white privilege sometimes is about what you don't have to deal with. Those experiences that you don't have to experience. They don't understand that privilege is coming from a family unit where you have four grandparents, you have two parents, and then you get to grow up with your siblings. And I'll tell you right now, I don't come from a privileged background like that. I don't know. I met my grandpa on my dad's side, and then he passed away. All my grandparents passed away. We're the aunties now. None of my family, I feel like any of my elders, I have two uncles, but the women in my family all passed away before the age of 60. So when we look at statistically speaking, like let's go to stats. I know everybody loves those. I don't. But when we look at statistics of Indigenous people, they are a marginalized population that are impacted by all of these things. Going back to white privilege, they don't have to experience those things. They don't have to experience loved ones with addictions. They don't have to experience people being racist to them when they go to the bank or they go to Walmart or they go to a bookstore to buy books for their PhD. Those aren't real situations at all. I hope you recognize the sarcasm there. Yeah, like those are things that Indigenous people have to do on a regular basis. Getting a job, getting an apartment, and having to face racism. So when we think about white privilege, it's really important for people as well, like going back to when you talked about, oh, well, I would never do those things. This is the part of the conversation maybe that a lot of people don't want to hear. But it's the truth. And truth makes us feel uncomfortable, but that's where we should be. So if this makes you feel uncomfortable, this is a necessary part of moving towards reconciliation. White privilege or non-Indigenous people, any person that isn't Indigenous needs to understand how they are benefiting off of all of those things that are impacting Indigenous people today. That's called settler colonialism. So any newcomer, any settler who doesn't have to experience those things as a privilege is benefiting off of Indigenous people's impoverishment, the taking of our land, all of those things. So it's a very complex issue. And I want to say I broke it down as easily as I could in the time that we have. But, that's where we need to look. That's where we need to focus our attention on. Because anybody who says that they're not a part of truth and reconciliation, you need to understand your role and your responsibility. And when we think about Indigenous ways of knowing, that Indigenous and Western worldview says, I have rights. I have a right. I'm a Canadian. Yeah. This is mine. Whereas Indigenous people, we say, I have a responsibility. We don't have rights. We have responsibilities to those 7 generations forward, right? So
I really think that's super powerful and super key, because I know in my own work, I was a principal, and just the levels of power that I saw among even my staff, was really, really fascinating. Like, research needs to be done there, because exactly like what you said, if they were non-Indigenous, and particularly if they were white, I really noticed that there was a lot more of exactly what you said. It was the rights. They would walk into my office. It was about power. It was about autonomy. I need this. You need to give me a yes. And then if I gave a no, now we saw all kinds of behaviors. Right? And then if it was an Indigenous person, I almost never saw that kind of a behavior, because it's like you said, it's a very different mentality, it's a different culture, and people, I think a lot of times in Indigenous communities, it's not about me because we really talk about we, it's about a collective all of the time. And so, how is this going to benefit the group or, all of the students or whatnot? Whereas it can be very different in a Western mentality. It can very much be about me versus we,
Right. I wanted to interject just for a second because you're saying me and we. I wanted to go back to when I talked about Indigenous people and our healing. Because oftentimes we're told, oh, have humility and those are not our ways. And when I said looking at self, that's not selfish, right? Me and we, because, and the way that I position it is that like mothers, right? Us as women, you have children, I have a child, and how can I be a mother and take care of somebody else if I don't take care of myself first? So when I talked about that way that Indigenous people can heal, that me and we, very, very colonial, very Western, right?
Yeah. But I do think that, and that's going to definitely be a part of my podcast too, that, there's a difference between selfless and selfish, right?
Absolutely.
Like selfless and when we're talking about healing of the self, and that's exactly what we do with this podcast is, speaking to all of those 4 quadrants, the mental, emotional, physical, spiritual health, so that we can take care of ourselves.
Right.
And the point of taking care of ourselves is so that we can take care of the world. So we can take care of others, because it's community oriented, right? It's not about we're taking care of self so that we can conquer the world,
Right.
because then that's different, right? Then that's a very different motivation.
Very
and I
Western.
think, for Indigenous people, it's just like in the airplane, where, you have to give yourself the air so that you can give the next person air so that you can help them, right? And so I really do think that, healing of yourself is not selfish. I 100% agree with that. That's because we have to, in order to give to the community and take care of the community. We can't do that from an empty cup. We can't do that if we're falling apart at the seams. We have to really take care of ourselves, and particularly because we come from communities that have been so broken as a result of colonialism, so broken on every single level that all of your family is impacted, right? And I know that's true for my family. We can look at all of, the issues and the addictions and the things that my own family has experienced, and I'm no different than every other Indigenous person in this country.
Yeah, I definitely.
So then, now that we're talking about some of those things and focusing on, our own healing as Indigenous people so that we can, do some of this work, what about for non-Indigenous people? What do you think? Do you think it's similar?
Again, I do feel like it is similar when I say self. And I feel like it goes well with what we were just talking about, right? The difference between selfish and selfless. Because I don't think that there is enough people out there who are willing to look at themselves, right? They're not willing to look at how they might be benefiting, or how, how their job might attribute to systemic issues that are still impacting Indigenous peoples, right? Or how potentially their job, that role in their job, could benefit Indigenous people, how it could help Indigenous people, and it's not being utilized in the way that it should be, right? I think that non-Indigenous people, and I'm going to share some amazing words from somebody on my podcast, Mitch Bourbonnier. He's a non-Indigenous ally doing a lot of work here in Winnipeg. He's done a lot of action therapy and works with action therapists with the Indigenous community. And I always remember his words that he shared on my podcast to non-Indigenous people, to allies. He said, all you got to do is show up and shut up. That's it. Just show up and shut up. Because again, For a long time, Indigenous people we're not voiceless. We've been silenced. We are unheard. For a long time, we didn't have the ability, right? Let's go back to the Indian Act where things were outlawed. We couldn't do things. We couldn't even hire a lawyer, right? Our narratives have been told to us. Our narratives have been changed, mythologized, stereotyped, stigmatized, and then fed back to us. So when we think about non-Indigenous people coming, that's all they need to do. You want to be an ally? Show up and shut up. You're not there to talk. You're not there to unless you're being asked, unless you're being invited to do so by an Indigenous person. We should be facilitating reconciliation or ReconciliACTION, as I like to call it, for, by, and with Indigenous people. That's how we need to move forward for non-Indigenous people. And again, that recognizing, acknowledging that you have a role and responsibility, and you also need to heal. Because if you feel uncomfortable hearing anything that I just said, anything that I've passed on in this podcast, that means that there's work that you need to do, and nobody can do that work for you, just you.
I think that's really such a powerful statement, period, for health in general, that if you're feeling uncomfortable, there's work there that you need to be exploring, that you need to be doing, right?
It's been a long time coming for me. I learned that the hard way, unfortunately.
Yeah, but how powerful, right? Like, and I think of my own healing journey, and I think about some of the things that were so hard to talk about in the beginning. And then the more that, exactly like what you said, the more that you give voice to it, the more that you dig deep and unpack it and sit with those uncomfortable feelings, the easier it gets, right? Like, and I don't know that something that you talk about that was uncomfortable, I don't know that if it ever goes to the side where I'm totally comfortable with this. I don't know that it ever gets there, but I know that it does get easier, right, the more that you're doing that work, right?
So again, and I'm gonna shout out another one of my podcast guests. I learn a lot from my podcast guests. One of the social workers that I worked with when I was a support worker way back when I was in my undergrad, Rob, he came on and talked a little bit, and I always remember him saying, I've never met a fully healed person. And that has stuck with me for I don't know, when was that? Maybe 2020, 2021. And the fact that, let's go back to my own healing journey where I said I learned the hard way, right? I've done a lot of healing work. I remember my first day at therapy, right? Therapy, mental health is very stigmatized, I want to say, in our society today. And said like, oh, well, something, you have a deficit, something must be wrong with you if you're going to therapy. I'll tell you this right now. The one thing that I've learned about therapy is that the people who go to therapy are usually going to therapy because of the people in their lives who don't go to therapy. So with that being said, I remember the first day that I walked into that office, and this was TRC year, 2015, 10 years. Wow, it's been 10 years, off and on. But I remember I talked to that lady and I said, when are we gonna be done? And she's like, what do you mean? It's an hour session. And I'm all like, no, I mean, like, how long do you think I'm gonna have to keep coming here? And she's like, well, we'll see, like we're gonna work through that and we're gonna see. And so I always think about, that message that Rob shared, is that I've never met a fully healed person, and that, this healing journey that I'm on is an ongoing journey, right? I'll talk about how I'm a lifelong learner. I'm always learning tools. I'm always building my tool belt, and I'm always thinking about I can continue my healing in order to continue doing the work that I do, because the work that I do is heavy. It is hard. It is dealing with the things when you mentioned, I don't think it ever goes away. It doesn't. It doesn't go away. And as much as I've made, like yesterday, I was at I'm doing a fashion show. I like to do that too. That's another thing to add to the
Cool.
list. I'm a designer and artist, and I was talking about one of my pieces had just come from Winniskewin. They're in Saskatoon, actually.
Yeah,
My
yeah.
piece was a part of the MMIWG2S exhibit that they just had there from June to October. And so one of the girls is going to be walking down the runway, and I was talking to her about it, and I was saying, I want you to carry a picture of my mom down the runway, and I'm going to blow up this picture so that you can carry it. And I saw her get very emotional, and I said to her, she said, I'm sorry. And I said, and I touched her hand, and I said, it's okay. I said, it's taken me a long time to get here to where I'm okay to do this, right? Like in honor of my mom. The scab, you know, our hurt feelings, it kind of scabs over, and after a while the scab goes away, but the scar's still there, right?
There. You know what, I think that every time you do something like that, like you acknowledge your late mom and your fashion show, that it probably, you know, is a little bit healing for you every time you do that, because then you're also honoring, you know, all the beautiful things about your mom and her, you know, bringing you into this world and stuff, and keeping her alive, really, like things like that definitely keep her alive and keep her spirit alive. And I think that's really so beautiful that you do that, even if it, you know, probably was really hard at first.
Honestly, my master's, that's the only reason that I went for my master's, was to tell my mom's stories. Let's plug that for anybody. Earlier I talked about being unheard, so my master's was called Unheard Voices. And I literally went into my master's because I wanted to tell my mom's story. My mom never received justice. There was no investigation by police into her murder. And, you know, it's still that way today. It's been 20 plus years, right? And that work that I did in my master's, honestly, I feel like it was like everything in my life aligned because of that mental, that physical, that spiritual, that emotional, just the process that I went through writing that thesis. And it was so hard. Like, it was so hard. Like, I don't even know how I got through it. Now that I'm sitting here struggling with my PhD, but I've come to realize, and I've really come to know that that was my healing journey. That was the piece that I needed to be able to get from before, and there was definitely an after. We're in the after now, so that's good.
That's really amazing. And I'm sure that, you know, you got through because of your late mom. You know, I'm sure she was there every step of the way, pushing you along, and creator helping you too, you know. I mean, it's amazing. These higher ed journeys are really, you know, something else.
Higher ed?
I know for myself. Yeah.
Right.
Higher ed journeys, yeah, for master's or doctorate. And I know, you know, it was the same for me when I did my master's, and but not the same in the sense that, you know, your story with your mom was, you know, probably very different. But I know my experience going through a master's, I was a leader at that time. I was a principal at a school, and I found that it was so challenging to be leading while I was, you know, going to school. Every spare minute I had was my master's, and but at the same time, it really helped me in my leadership, because every issue I had, I was able to unpack in my work, in my schoolwork. And so it helped me. It was one of those, you know, kind of processes that they just really helped each other really beautifully. And I think it's been very much the same for me with my doctorate, that it's challenging work, but at the same time, the levels of self that you get to, unpack and explore and heal. It's just really amazing journeys, but not easy. I definitely empathize with people who are maybe not ready for that, because they're really intense journeys.
I definitely feel like, let's go back to, colonialism. I always like to tell my students, I'm like, we're in the house of colonialism. Being the education system, like I literally work in the house of colonialism. I'm inside trying to dismantle. I think that people really need to realize when they're trying to plan to go back to school is that they need to understand that these systems were not created for Indigenous people. They were created to dismantle our communities and to for us to destruct, essentially. So going in with that mentality into this system, you use the word intense. I've been told I'm intense. I've been told that I am quite intense. So maybe that's why I thrive in the system. I think it's definitely, yeah, it's a singular journey, right, for everybody. And it is challenging. Like higher education is not for everyone. Definitely not.
That's very true. I wanted to ask you about the calls to action. Are there any calls to action that you feel are maybe more pressing than others, or things that you're really,
Financial.
you really, sorry?
Financial.
The financial ones?
I feel like when we look at addressing the calls to action, if you break them down and you look at them, these are actionable measures that should be taken by government. Like that's what these calls to action are saying. And they're saying Indigenous people have been underfunded. Why are they impoverished? Because they've been underfunded. Why are they lacking education? Why are they lacking skills? Because they've been underfunded. So like one of the things that I'll often share, put your money where your mouth is. Why are we're 10 years in, and how many calls to action have we addressed out of 94? I just did a couple talks during Reconciliation Week. The feds seem to think that they've achieved 18, which is a far off number from any number that I've heard. Some people are saying 8, some people are saying 10, some people are saying 13, but it's somewhere in the middle. And really, when we think about the finances, oftentimes, let's go back to the conversation again about non-Indigenous or allies, people who actionable measures that they can take to try to help reconciliation move forward. They sit and they say, oh, well, how can I change this? This call to action is talking about the government. Get people to come together and write to your government official. Start trying to push government to start acting, because that's the only way that we're going to actually see these calls to action being addressed. Because the financial aspect, I think we've had enough of settlements. Where's the reparation? Right? We need reparation. We don't need one-time settlements that aren't going to do much for Indigenous people, right? We need reparation, actionable reparation. That's a continuous thing. And I think that's why these calls haven't been addressed, because they're not financially motivated to do that.
Do you happen to know which areas they claim that they've addressed?
I mean, I feel like the one that always comes to mind is the national inquiry. There was such a push for the national inquiry, and obviously because that's my area of study. But the fact that, what has it achieved? I think it hasn't actually addressed the problem. It's just made it visible. So people can't deny it now. People can't deny that the main finding of the national inquiry is genocide. Is that Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people are specifically, systemically marginalized and targeted for genocide. So we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do.
What do you think for the MMIWG2S plus? I hope I get it right. Okay. how do you, like, how can we support these groups? Do you think it's more funding? Like, what do you think? Because I know that these numbers are still quite high. You know, I turn on social media any given day and somebody's missing again. Like, what can we do? How can we support them?
I think that there's a lot of different ways. And again, I can't say one way because these are multi-layered problems, right? Like I mentioned earlier, is that they're all connected, right? That let's specifically look at Tina Fontaine, right? She was a 15-year-old girl found in the Red River here in Winnipeg. She was in child welfare. She was placed in a hotel, and you know, the media called her a runaway. They also misidentified her as a woman, and I believe as a prostitute. So there's all of these things where it's like, oh well, the media's in there, the child welfare system basically, you know, didn't support her, didn't help her, essentially funneled her into where she was to have this happen. And then not to mention in 2018, you know, the person believed to be her murderer, I believe it was her murderer, was acquitted by the justice system. So when we think about, you know, actionable measures, that's why this national inquiry is so big and thick, why there's 2 volumes, right? Why we have the national inquiry and we have the TRC report, and the new special interlocutor report that was just released last year on the missing children and unmarked burials, right? We have all these documents, like TRC's like 4,000 pages if you read them all. There's so much to do and there's so much to uncover and unpack. That's why I always go back to education, right? So it's like, how can we support, you know, ending the crisis of MMIW G2S? It begins one person at a time, right? I mean, I want to go back to healing too, right? And self, you know, if we begin helping ourselves first in order to help our community, those are our ways. Those are our traditional Indigenous communal practices, right? You need to have healthy self, then you think about your family, and then once you have a, you know, a safe, loving, healthy family, then you work on community. And once you have that healthy, loving, safe community, then you work on your nation, right? And it's this, you know, it's not a hierarchy, right? Where it's like, oh, me before everybody else, right?
I feel like it's like expanding circles, you know?
Right.
That's kind of how I look at it. Like because hierarchy, that's such a Western concept. Right. But I do think that, you know, if we look at the circle getting bigger and bigger and bigger, every layer that we kind of heal, then I think it's a little more all-encompassing.
And there's always enough room for everybody in the circle. That's one of the things that I always share, because again, this way that we connect in the Western world, right, is like me, you know, me first. And it's like, well, there's enough for everybody, right?
Yep. 100%. Well, you know, I think this has been a really powerful episode. You know, I'm really grateful for your time and your expertise and your knowledge. You're so knowledgeable in this area, and so I really appreciate all that you've shared today. Is there anything that, you know, maybe I missed something, or there's something that you would like to mention before we leave?
My final words, or Jerry's final thoughts, right? I'm gonna just share, be gentle with yourself, and with, you know, your healing and your journey, and, you know, be gentle with the world, be gentle with other people, because often when we think about truth and reconciliation, when we think about healing and we think about our impact on the world, I always, and this is how you can tell that I am an early elementary school teacher, my words of advice is be kind, be gentle, and be kind, because it doesn't take very much to be kind. When you see that person who's struggling, When you walk down the street, smile at them, acknowledge them, because you don't know what has led them to that place, right? It doesn't take very much to be kind. And I think sometimes we're in such a rush, right? This world that we live in, rush, go, 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 right? And so when we go back to ceremony and we go to these places where we begin to connect, with our whole self, mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual, we begin to realize, we learn that teaching, to be still, to be quiet, right, ourselves, so that we can connect and slow down. That's when we can start to realize that, right, and how we have an impact on the world, because a lot of people don't realize. I don't think there's enough people in the world that realize, if every single person in the world was kind, was gentle, what would our world look like, right?
Absolutely. Very beautiful message to leave us all with. And it's been such a great session. I'm really grateful that we were able to sit down today. Thank you so much for all of your knowledge that you've shared with us. And I know you did mention your podcast is called Truth Before Reconciliation. Yes. So people can look for it on Spotify, Amazon, maybe Apple Music. And then also your consulting.
My consulting, you can find me at www.tammygwolfconsulting.com. I'm also an artist. You can find me at www.redhummingbirddesigns.com. You can find my podcast on YouTube, Truth Before Reconciliation 94. You can also find me on Facebook at Truth Before Reconciliation. Tammy G. Wolfe Consulting and Red Hummingbird Designs are all my side projects. So,
and you did mention there was a poster of something coming out.
Yes, so I will be releasing a poster announcing the new season coming up in the next few days, week. I don't know. I also have two fashion shows that are coming up because I'm a designer/artist. I'm going to be at Saskatchewan Fashion Week. Jessica, you should come check me out in Saskatoon. We should connect.
Absolutely.
And meet each other in person. And then I also have crafted on the catwalk here in Winnipeg at the Winnipeg Art Gallery. I also have some publications coming out in the new year. I'm going to be a part of a social work focused book on footprints to healing, I believe, which I will be sharing the stories I carry, part of my journey, my healing, that's kind of connected to this, as well as beadwork is medicine.
Aw, so cool. Well, I'm sending you lots of love and blessings for all of these amazing projects that you're going to be doing right away, that everything goes very well. And I can't wait to meet you during Fashion Week. So, definitely let me know. I'm not sure when that is. So
next week on the 30th, November 1st. November 1st?
Yeah. Okay, good. I think I'm around then, so that'll be awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, and good luck with everything. It has been so wonderful to get to know you, and this episode, I believe, should be out in the next couple weeks. It won't be very long, so I'll share that online, and hopefully everybody listens, and we get a lot of people who learn as much as I did. I feel like I learned an awful lot this episode, so I'm really grateful to you for that.
Thanks, Jessica. I really appreciate you welcoming me here, and I hope that the listeners have learned something, and just remember to take what you need and leave the rest.
Absolutely. All right. Well, take care, Tammy, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much, Jessica.
Bye. Bye.